Hello, welcome back. In today's class, we will see how Wittgenstein treated philosophy or what's philosophy according to Wittgenstein's point of view. As we have seen earlier, there are two phases in the philosophy of Wittgenstein, the early view as well as the later view. The main book that pertaining to the early view, as we have seen, is the Tractatus, and all these books related to later view of Wittgenstein was published posthumously. And as we have seen earlier, there are drastic differences between the early view and the later view. However, as far as the task of philosophy according to Wittgenstein is concerned, there are some similarities also. First, we'll look into the common features of philosophy according to both the philosophies, the early as well as later philosophies of Wittgenstein. Then we will take up one by one the early philosophy as well as the later philosophy. So, Wittgenstein took distinct but related approach to the task of philosophy in his early and later period. There are similarities as well as there are differences among his approach to philosophy. And in both the cases, it can be seen that philosophical problems are caused out of our incorrect understanding of language. The linguistic approach towards the philosophical problems can be seen in both the philosophies of Wittgenstein, the early as well as the later. So, for Wittgenstein, there are no genuine philosophical problems. The philosophical problems are caused out of our incorrect understanding of language. So, the correction to the philosophical problems are to be made in language, not in the world. And according to both the versions, there are no genuine philosophical problems. As it's a misunderstanding of language, there are no genuine problems. So, all the problems of philosophy are really linguistic problems. So, the task of philosophy becomes the linguistic analysis. The analysis of language becomes the task of philosophy. There are no genuine philosophical problems, but only linguistic problems, as far as Wittgenstein is concerned, in general. Now, coming to the early views of Wittgenstein, that is the views that is described mainly in Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. According to the Tractarian view, philosophical problems are caused out of misunderstanding the logic of language. As we have seen, the Tractatus insists on the syntactic meaning, or the role the syntax plays in generating the meaning for a sentence. So, we have to focus more on the logic of language in order to understand philosophical problems. So, the cause of philosophical problems is the misunderstanding of the logic of language. Philosophy, Wittgenstein considers as one among natural sciences. So, the task of philosophy is the analysis or correct understanding of reality according to Wittgenstein. So, he considers philosophy as in the group of natural sciences. The picture theory of meaning rests upon a single rigid meaning of language. Hence, there is a single discoverable essence of reality. This we have to understand clearly. As far as the picture theory of meaning is concerned, as we have seen, it's a referential theory. And for a particular statement, for a particular proposition, there is a rigid meaning which is determinate. We have seen two aspects of picture, that is determinate as well as experimental. The determinate nature of the picture gives a rigid meaning to it. And if the meaning is rigid, then there is a rigid, unalterable reality. Or there is a single reality which is unalterable and which is discoverable also. So, the meaning as it is related to reality, since the meaning is a rigid one, the reality must be a discoverable one. It must be an objective one. It's not subjective because the meaning doesn't depend on the context or on the user, but one and the same proposition always will have one and the same meaning. So it must be a discoverable meaning. Hence, we can get out of philosophical problems through the correct understanding of the logic of language. So there is a reality and it can be represented in language. And as far as the early philosophy is concerned, If there is any problem in understanding, or if there is any philosophical problems caused, then it cannot be the problem of reality. It must be the problem of our misunderstanding of language, or the logic of language is misunderstood. So, to get out of philosophical problems is to get out of the incorrect understanding, or it is to correctly understand the logic of language. Now, hence the task of philosophy, according to early Wittgenstein, is the logical clarification of thought. The problem, the philosophical problem, is not in the world, but in the logic of our understanding, logic of our thought. We have got an incorrect logic, means we misunderstood the correct logic or for the incorrect one. So, the clarification is to be done in our thoughts. Hence, for Wittgenstein, philosophy is a therapy. And this notion of philosophy as a therapy is common for both early philosophy as well as later philosophy. It's a therapy in the sense. In therapy, we are not touching the reality. If somebody is facing the term is adapted from psychology or psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, if someone has some sort of trauma, then whatever has happened is happened. We cannot go and alter the past. So what is done in case of therapy is to give a new logic to the patient or client to understand the reality from a different perspective. So the way in which we look into reality is changed. Or in philosophy, the logic, the structure through which we look into reality is changed. Since the problem comes out of our incorrect understanding, the solution is to be done through the correct understanding. So it's the understanding that changes. So in that sense, philosophy is a therapy. It does not alter the reality, but only enable us to understand correctly. As it's therapy, it's not going to change the reality. The reality is there as it is. We are going to change our perception, the way we look into reality, to understand it correctly. And accordingly, the philosophical problems are rather dissolved rather than being solved. For a problem to be solved, there must be a problem. Now, since there are no genuine philosophical problems, there is nothing to be solved. So, we'll finally understand that there is no problem to be solved. So, the question is dissolved. The problem is dissolved. There is no problem to be solved. The problem is in our understanding, and when we correctly understand, we understand that there is no such thing as problem. So the problem is dissolved in our thoughts. Where there is no solution, there can neither be genuine question. Since there is no genuine problem, there cannot be any genuine question. And if at all a question can be asked, it can also be answered. If there is a genuine philosophical question, then it can be answered. If it's not answerable, it's because the problem pertaining to the question is not a genuine problem. So there is no answer. There is a dissolution for that problem. This is about the early views. Coming to the later views of Wittgenstein. And in his later philosophy, Wittgenstein rejected the rigid notion of meaning and described in his earlier philosophy. We have seen that the Tractatus has got a rigid notion of meaning, whereas in philosophical investigation and in his later philosophy, there is no rigid meaning ascribed to a proposition. There exists a motley of meaning, a variety of meaning for a single proposition. The meaning depends on the context of the language or the language game. We have also seen that the meaning changes from one and the same proposition, takes different meaning in different language games. So the meaning changes from context to context, from culture to culture, from society to society for one and the same statement. So the problems are caused by the misunderstanding one use for another. So the philosophical problems arises not because of the incorrect understanding of the logic as in Tractatus, but because we understand one use for another use. For example, as we have seen earlier, the meaning of keep in I will keep in the mind and I will keep in tin box. The keeping is different in both the usage. So when we understand or when we misunderstand one use for another, the philosophical problem arises. So, propositions of one language game, if interpreted in another, causes ambiguity of meaning. The task of philosophy is correctly interpret the language games and thereby meaning of a proposition. So the philosophical problems are caused because we do not understand the context of its use or the language game in which it's used. So the task of philosophy is to interpret the problem in the correct language game. When it's interpreted in the correct language game, then the problem no more exists. Or the task is to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. The fly is trapped in the fly bottle. The task is you need not to take the fly out of the bottle, just show the way. Just open the lid and show the way it will go out. In the same way, just showing which language game it is to be used. And if you correctly use it in the language game, in the specific language game, then there is no problem exists. The problem dissolves. The fly will go, the problem will go out of the context. So philosophy leaves everything as it is. It does not, as far as Wittgenstein is concerned, philosophy is not going to test the reality. Philosophy leaves everything as it is. It does not alter reality, enable us to perceive it correctly. It does not alter, but philosophy enables us to perceive it, the reality correctly. The task is to analyze problems in the use of language and to show that there is no genuine problem. So here also, philosophy is a sort of therapy. In the early philosophy, it was a therapy through changing our logic. Here, it is to make our perception correctly, to understand the correct language game, and the task is to analyze problems in the use of language and to show that there is no genuine philosophical problems. By looking into in that way, we'll realize that there is no genuine philosophical problems, and in that sense, philosophy becomes a therapy. The task of philosophy thus is to describe language and not to explain it. It's to describe how language is used, not to explain how it is to be used or why it is used. So the task of philosophy is to describe only. Now, to sum up, for Wittgenstein, philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intellect by the use of language. Through the use of language, we are being deceived. Our intellect is being deceived. And philosophy battles against that. It's a fight against the deceiving of our intellect by language. So it's the fight to use the language in the correct way, to understand the language in its correct context. That's the task of philosophy. So the task of philosophy, again, as we have seen earlier, becomes the language analysis. And the task of philosophy as language analysis is common for both its early as well as its later philosophy. And that's about philosophy, the use of philosophy as far as Wittgenstein is concerned. That's all about Wittgenstein. Thank you. Bye.